The rope around Sara Emerson's wrists burned as the sheriff dragged her toward the edge of Oahe, Nevada, where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving under the scorching July sun of 1882. She stumbled, her worn boots catching on rocks, but no one moved to help her because they all knew who her father was, what he had done, and they believed his evil ran through her veins like poisoned water through a dying well. "Please," Sara whispered, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. "I had nothing to do with what he did. I swear it." Sheriff Morrison's weathered face remained hard as granite. "Your father murdered 3 men in cold blood, robbed the bank, and burned down the general store. The circuit judge hanged him last month, but that does not erase what you are. Bad blood breeds bad blood, girl. We want no part of you in our town." The crowd that had gathered to watch her exile murmured agreement. Sara recognized most of their faces, people she had known her entire 22 years of life. Mrs. Henderson, who used to sell her ribbons at the Mercantile, Tom Watkins, who had once asked her to dance at the Harvest Social, the Reverend Collins, who had baptized her when she was just an infant. Now they all stared at her with disgust and fear, as though she carried some contagion that might spread if she remained. "My mother," Sara tried again, desperate. "She died giving birth to me. I never even knew my father until 3 years ago when he showed up. I tried to turn him away. I tried to tell him he was not welcome, but he would not listen. How can you punish me for his crimes?" "You let him stay under your roof," someone shouted from the crowd. "You fed him, gave him shelter." "Because he was my father," Sara cried out, tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. "What daughter could turn away her own blood?" "One with sense," Sheriff Morrison said coldly. He untied the rope from her wrists, but kept his hand on his gun. "You have 1 canteen of water, the clothes on your back, and that is more mercy than you deserve. If you set foot in Oahe again, we will see you hanged alongside your father's memory. Now get moving before I change my mind about the water." Sara clutched the canteen he thrust into her hands, her fingers trembling. She looked one last time at the only home she had ever known, the small house at the end of Main Street where she had lived alone since her aunt passed 5 years ago. Everything she owned remained inside, her mother's wedding ring, the few photographs she possessed, the quilt her aunt had sewn. All of it lost to her now. "Please," she whispered one final time, but no one answered. The crowd had already begun to disperse, returning to their lives as though she had never existed at all. Sara turned toward the desert, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no horse, no food, no supplies beyond the single canteen. The nearest town was Silver Creek, 40 miles to the east, through brutal terrain where rattlesnakes hunted in the shadows, and the sun could kill a person in hours. But she had no choice. She started walking. The first day nearly destroyed her. The July heat rose from the cracked earth in shimmering waves that made the horizon dance and blur. Sara's dark hair, once pinned neatly, fell loose around her shoulders, offering no protection from the relentless sun. Her calico dress, which had been modest and clean that morning, grew stiff with sweat and dust. She rationed the water carefully, allowing herself only small sips when her tongue felt like leather in her mouth. By nightfall, she had covered perhaps 8 miles, her feet blistering inside her boots. She found a small outcropping of rocks that offered minimal shelter and collapsed behind it, her body shaking with exhaustion. The desert cold came fast and brutal after sunset, and she had no blanket, no fire. She curled into herself, crying quietly into her arms, wondering if she would survive to see morning. She did survive, though she woke to find a scorpion crawling near her hand. She jerked away with a gasp, her heart racing as the creature scuttled off into a crevice. Her lips had cracked during the night, and when she took a sip from the canteen, she tasted blood along with the water. The second day proved even worse than the first. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, making her dizzy and weak. She saw no signs of life except for a vulture circling high overhead, patient and knowing. Twice, She thought she spotted water in the distance, only to realize she was seeing mirages, cruel tricks of heat and desperation. She kept walking because stopping meant dying. On the third day, her water ran out. Sara tipped the canteen back, catching the last few drops on her swollen tongue, and then stared at the empty container with numb despair. She had covered perhaps 25 miles, maybe less. She would never make it to Silver Creek. The desert would claim her bones, and in time no one would remember she had ever existed. Perhaps that was justice, she thought dimly. Perhaps she truly was cursed by her father's sins. She kept walking anyway, though her steps had become slow and lurching. The sun beat down with merciless intensity, and she began to hallucinate. She saw her mother, a woman she had never known except through a single faded photograph, walking beside her in a white dress. She saw her aunt calling her home for supper. She saw her father hanging from the gallows, his face purple and distorted, and she cried out, falling to her knees in the burning sand. She did not know how long she knelt there, the sun scorching the back of her neck. Long enough that she stopped feeling the pain, long enough that she stopped caring about anything at all. She closed her eyes and waited for death to be merciful. The sound of hoofbeats seemed like another hallucination at first. Sara did not open her eyes, did not want to face another cruel trick of her failing mind. But then a shadow fell across her, blocking the sun, and a voice spoke, deep and concerned. Christ Almighty. She is still breathing. Hold on, miss. I have got you. Strong arms lifted her from the ground as though she weighed nothing at all. Sara's eyes fluttered open, and through her blurred vision, she saw a man's face, tanned and angular with startling blue eyes beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He smelled of leather and horse and sweat, solid and real. Water, she managed to croak. Easy now, the man said, settling her carefully against his chest as he knelt. He pulled a canteen from his belt and held it to her lips. Small sips. Too much at once will make you sick. The water touched her tongue, and Sara nearly sobbed with relief. She tried to drink greedily, but the man pulled the canteen back, true to his word. I know it is hard, but you need to trust me. Just a little at a time. Over the next several minutes, he gave her water in measured amounts, patient and steady. Sara's vision began to clear, and she could see him more distinctly now. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with sandy brown hair that curled at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. He wore typical cowboy attire, a worn shirt, leather vest, chaps over his pants, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. Thank you, Sara whispered when she could finally form words properly. What in God's name are you doing out here alone? He asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. You have got no horse, no supplies? Did you get separated from a wagon train? Sara closed her eyes, shame washing over her. No, I was cast out. Cast out? The man frowned, confusion creasing his brow. From where? Auihi, Sara said quietly. 3 days ago. They sent you into the desert with nothing? The man's voice rose with anger. What kind of people would do such a thing? The kind who do not want a murderer's daughter in their town. The words hung in the air between them. Sara watched the man's expression, waiting for the familiar disgust and fear to appear, for him to drop her in the sand and ride away, but instead, his face softened with something that looked almost like sadness. What is your name? He asked gently. Sara Emerson. I am Blake Porter. I am a ranch hand at the Double R, about 15 miles north of here. He adjusted his hold on her, still keeping her supported. I was riding fence line when I spotted you. Thought you were a mirage at first myself. You should leave me, Sara said, though the words cost her everything. If people know you helped me, they will turn on you too. That is what happens to anyone who shows kindness to people like me. Blake's jaw tightened, and he shook his head firmly. First off, I am not leaving anyone to die in the desert. I do not care what their last name is or who their kin were. Second, you keep saying people like you as though you committed some crime yourself, did you? No, but my father. I did not ask about your father, Blake interrupted, his blue eyes intense. I asked about you. Did you rob anyone? Did you kill anyone? Did you burn down any buildings? Of course not, Sara said, her voice breaking. I would never, but it does not matter what I did or did not do. His blood is my blood. His crimes are my burden. That is the biggest load of horse manure I have ever heard, Blake said bluntly. He stood, lifting her with him, and carried her toward his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding that waited patiently nearby. You are not your father's crimes, Sara Emerson. You are your own person, and anyone who says different is a fool. Those words, spoken with such conviction, struck something deep in Sara's chest. She had heard nothing but condemnation for months, ever since her father's arrest and trial. The entire town had treated her like a leper, crossing the street to avoid her, refusing to sell her goods, whispering behind her back. Even before the sheriff cast her out, she had been living in a kind of exile, isolated and alone. But this stranger, this cowboy who owed her nothing, looked at her as though she mattered, as though she deserved to live. I do not understand, Sara whispered as Blake settled her carefully onto his horse before swinging up behind her. Why would you help me? Because it is the right thing to do, Blake said simply. He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her and took up the reins with his other hand. And because I know something about being judged for things beyond your control. Now hold on. We have got a bit of a ride ahead of us, and you need proper food and rest. Sara leaned back against his solid chest, too exhausted to argue. As the horse began to move, carrying her away from certain death, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The ride to the Double R Ranch took several hours. Blake kept his horse to a steady but careful pace, clearly aware of Sara's fragile condition. He gave her water at regular intervals and spoke to her periodically, asking simple questions to keep her conscious and alert. How old are you, Sara? 22. You? 27. Been working ranches since I was 15. Your family owns the Double R? Blake gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. No, I am just hired help. My family does not own anything anymore. Lost our farm in Missouri after my father died. Debts took everything. My mother and sisters moved in with my aunt in St. Louis, and I came west to find work. I am sorry, Sara said softly. Nothing to be sorry about. It was a long time ago, and we all survived. That is what matters. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper trees. In the distance, Sara could see mountains rising blue and hazy against the sky. The land here showed signs of cattle grazing, and eventually she spotted wooden fence posts marking property boundaries. That is the ranch just ahead, Blake said, nodding toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. The foreman is a decent man named Jack Curtis. He and I have worked together for 3 years now. I trust him. But will he trust me? Sara asked anxiously. When he learns who I am, then we will not tell him right away, Blake said practically. You need rest and food first. After that, we will figure things out. The ranch came into clearer view as they approached. The main house was a sprawling structure built of wood and stone, clearly expanded over many years. Several outbuildings surrounded it, including a large barn, a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, and various storage sheds. Corrals held dozens of horses, and in the distant pastures, Sara could see cattle grazing. A few ranch hands looked up as Blake rode in, curiosity evident on their faces. A tall man with graying hair and a thick mustache emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Blake, you are back earlier than expected, the man called out. Then he caught sight of Sara, and his expression shifted to concern. What happened? Who is this? Found her out in the desert, Jack, Blake said, dismounting and then carefully lifting Sara down. She swayed on her feet, and he kept a steadying hand on her elbow. She has been out there for days with no supplies. She needs help. Jack Curtis stepped closer, his weathered face kind but cautious. Of course, of course. Let us get her to the cookhouse. Maria can look after her. He called out in rapid Spanish, and a moment later, a stout woman with silver-streaked black hair hurried over from the main house. The woman, Maria, took one look at Sara and immediately began speaking in a mix of Spanish and English, her voice scolding and maternal at once. She put an arm around Sara's waist and started guiding her toward the cookhouse, still talking a steady stream. She is the ranch cook, Blake explained, walking alongside them. She has been here longer than anyone. She will take good care of you. Inside the cookhouse, Maria sat Sara down at a long wooden table and immediately pressed a cup of cool water into her hands. She examined Sara's sunburned face and cracked lips with gentle fingers, shaking her head and muttering. Then she bustled to the stove and began ladling soup into a bowl. Slow, small bites, Maria said firmly in heavily accented English, setting the bowl in front of Sara. Your stomach, she needs to remember food. The soup was simple, chicken broth with vegetables and soft bread on the side, but to Sara, it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. She forced herself to eat slowly as instructed, though her body screamed for her to devour everything in sight. Blake sat across from her, watching to make sure she was all right. Jack stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. So what is your story, miss? Jack asked after a few minutes. Where did you come from? And how did you end up alone in the desert? Sara's hand froze halfway to her mouth. She looked at Blake, fear flickering in her eyes. He gave her a small nod, encouraging. I came from Oahe, Sara said quietly. The people there did not want me anymore, so they sent me away. Sent you away? Jack's eyebrows rose. Why would they do that? Sara set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone despite her hunger. Because of who my father was. Because of what he did. And what did he do? He murdered 3 men, robbed a bank, and burned down a building. They hanged him for it last month. The silence that followed felt crushing. Sara could not bring herself to look up, could not bear to see the judgment she knew would be written on their faces. She waited for Jack to order her off the property, for Blake to regret his mercy. I see, Jack said finally. His voice was careful, measured. And were you involved in any of these crimes? No, Sara said, her voice barely audible. I had nothing to do with any of it. I barely knew my father. He only came back into my life 3 years ago, and I wish to God he never had. But they blamed you anyway, Blake said, anger threading through his words. His blood is my blood, Sara repeated what she had been told so many times. They said I was cursed by association, that I was dangerous. Jack was quiet for a long moment, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. Maria had stopped her bustling and stood with her hands on her hips, watching the foreman with sharp eyes. Miss Emerson, Jack said at last, I have been foreman of this ranch for 20 years. In that time, I have hired men running from the law, men running from bad marriages, men running from debts and fights and all manner of trouble. Some of them turned out to be good workers. Some turned out to be liars and thieves. But I will tell you this, I never once could tell which was which, just by looking at them or knowing who their kin were. Sara raised her eyes, hardly daring to hope. A man or a woman should be judged by their own actions, Jack continued, not by their father's sins or their brother's mistakes. If Blake says you need help and you have committed no crime yourself, then you are welcome here until you get back on your feet. After that, well, we will see. Thank you, Sara whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you so much. Maria immediately swooped in, making sympathetic noises and pressing a handkerchief into Sara's hands. You eat more, she commanded. Then you rest. Tomorrow, we worry about tomorrow. Over the following days, Sara slowly recovered her strength. Maria gave her a small room off the cookhouse, clean and simple with a narrow bed and a washstand. She ate regular meals, drank plenty of water, and let her sunburned skin heal. The other ranch hands were curious about her but polite, keeping their distance and asking no uncomfortable questions. Blake checked on her several times a day, always finding some excuse to stop by the cookhouse. He brought her things she might need: a bar of soap, a comb for her tangled hair, a straw hat to protect her face from the sun. They talked during these visits, careful conversations at first, but gradually growing more comfortable. "You do not have to keep looking after me," Sara said one afternoon as they sat on the cookhouse steps. "You saved my life. You do not owe me anything more." "I do not do it because I owe you," Blake said. He was whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife, his hands steady and sure. "I do it because I want to." "Why?" Sara asked, genuinely confused. "I am nothing but trouble. Everyone in Oahe made that clear." Blake set down his knife and wood, turning to look at her directly. "You want to know what I see when I look at you, Sara? I see a woman who survived 3 days in the desert with nothing. I see someone who had every reason to give up but kept walking anyway. I see courage and strength and kindness because even half dead from thirst, you worried about what trouble you might bring to me. That is who you are. Not your father's daughter. You." Sara's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such unwavering belief. "You do not really know me, though. What if you are wrong? What if there is something bad in me?" "There is not," Blake said with absolute certainty. "I am a pretty good judge of character, Sara. I have had to be, working ranches and living among all kinds of men. I know the difference between someone who is truly rotten and someone who has just been dealt a bad hand. You are good. I would bet my life on it." His words settled into Sara's heart like seeds in fertile soil, taking root and beginning to grow. She had spent so long being told she was cursed, tainted, dangerous. Hearing the opposite, especially from someone like Blake who seemed so solid and decent, made her want to believe it might be true. "I do not know what I am going to do," she admitted. "I cannot go back to Oahe. I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." "Then stay here," Blake said simply. "Jack already said you are welcome. Maria could use help in the cookhouse, and there is always work to be done on a ranch. You would earn your keep, build up some savings, and figure out your next step when you are ready. You think Jack would agree to that?" "I know he would. I already asked him." Sara turned to him, surprised. "You did?" Blake had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I might have mentioned it yesterday. Told him you were a hard worker and trustworthy. He said if you wanted to stay, he would pay you fair wages, same as anyone else." Fresh tears pricked Sara's eyes, but these were different from the tears of despair she had cried so often. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that felt almost like joy. "I do not know how to thank you, Blake. You have given me my life back." "You do not need to thank me," Blake said, his voice going soft. "Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will stop believing what those people in Oahe told you. Promise me you will see yourself the way you really are, not the way they tried to make you feel." Sara nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Blake smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his whole face, and picked up his whittling again. They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold. True to Jack's word, Sara was given a position helping Maria in the cookhouse. The work was hard, starting before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands and continuing until after supper was served and cleaned up. Sara cooked, cleaned, baked bread, preserved vegetables from the garden, and did countless other tasks. Her hands, soft from her previous life of living alone and doing light housework, grew calloused and strong. But she did not mind the hard work. In fact, she welcomed it. The physical labor left her too tired to dwell on the past, and the routine gave structure to her days. More than that, she felt useful and valued. Maria praised her cooking and taught her old family recipes. The ranch hands thanked her for meals and treated her with respect. Jack paid her wages every week, money that was hers alone, earned by her own efforts. And Blake continued to seek out her company whenever he could. He taught her to ride during her free time on Sunday afternoons, patient with her initial nervousness around the large animals. He showed her the best spots on the ranch, a creek where willows grew and birds sang, a hilltop with a view for miles in every direction, a hidden grove of cottonwood trees that stayed cool even in summer heat. They talked about everything and nothing. Blake told her stories about his childhood in Missouri, about his mother and three younger sisters whom he missed terribly. He spoke about the places he had traveled, the different ranches where he had worked, the good men and bad men he had encountered. He had a way of making even ordinary events sound interesting, his dry humor and keen observations bringing stories to life. Sara found herself opening up to him in ways she never had with anyone. She told him about her aunt who raised her, a stern but loving woman who taught her to read and sew and keep house. She described her lonely childhood in Owyhee, always feeling like an outsider because she had no parents and no siblings. She even talked about her father's sudden reappearance, how excited she had been at first to finally have family, only to slowly realize the man was selfish and cruel. "He used me," Sara admitted one evening as they sat by the creek, watching the sunset. "He stayed at my house because it gave him cover, made him look more respectable. But he did not care about me at all. When the sheriff came to arrest him, he tried to say I was his accomplice, that I helped him plan everything. It was not until they found evidence proving I was not even in town during the robbery that they believed I had no part in it." "Your own father tried to frame you?" Blake's voice was hard with anger. He was desperate. He would have done anything to save himself. Sara picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the creek, watching ripples spread across the water's surface. "That is what hurt the most, I think. Not that the town rejected me, but that he did. My own father valued his life so little that he tried to destroy mine." Blake reached over and took her hand, his palm warm and rough against hers. "He was not worth your pain, Sara. A real father would die before he let harm come to his child. That man was just a selfish coward." Sara looked down at their joined hands, something warm unfurling in her chest. "You always know exactly what to say." "Not always," Blake said with a slight smile. "But I try." They sat like that until full darkness fell, hands clasped, shoulders touching, something unspoken but powerful growing between them. As summer turned to autumn, Sara's life at the Double R settled into a comfortable rhythm. She had been at the ranch for 4 months now, and it felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. Maria treated her like a daughter, fussing over her and teaching her everything from cooking to cussing in Spanish. Jack praised her work ethic and gave her added responsibilities, including keeping the ranch's supply records and helping with inventory. The other hands respected her, and a few even sought her advice on things like mending clothes or writing letters to family back home. But it was Blake who occupied most of her thoughts. What had started as gratitude for her rescue had deepened into something far more complex. She found herself watching for him throughout the day, her heart lifting when she spotted him riding in from the range or working in the corrals. She treasured their conversations, his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She noticed small details about him, how he was always gentle with the horses, how he helped the younger ranch hands without making them feel inadequate, how he sent most of his wages home to his mother and sisters. Sara was falling in love with Blake Porter, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. One October afternoon, she was working in the garden behind the cookhouse, harvesting the last of the squash before the first frost came, when she heard raised voices from the front of the property. Curious and a little concerned, she stood and brushed dirt from her skirt, then walked around the building to see what was happening. A group of riders had arrived, maybe 6 or 7 men, all armed and dusty from travel. Jack stood talking to them, his posture tense. Blake and several other ranch hands had emerged from various buildings, forming a loose line behind the foreman. The air felt charged with tension. Sara moved closer but stayed back, sensing this was serious. She could hear parts of the conversation now. "Just passing through," one of the riders was saying. He was a lean man with a cruel face and a badge pinned to his vest. "We are tracking a criminal, a woman who fled from Owyhee after helping her father with his crimes. Name is Sara Emerson. You seen anyone fitting that description?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her hands began to tremble, and she took an instinctive step backward. But the movement caught the eye of one of the riders, and he pointed directly at her. "That is her," the man shouted. "That is Sara Emerson right there." Everything happened very fast after that. The riders started to dismount, hands moving toward their guns. Jack held up both hands, his voice sharp and commanding. "Hold on now. Nobody is drawing weapons on my property." "That woman is a wanted criminal," the badge-wearing man said coldly. "We have every right to take her into custody." "She is no such thing," Blake said, stepping forward. Sara saw that he had positioned himself between her and the riders. "Sara Emerson has committed no crime. She was cast out of Owyhee unjustly, and she has been working here honestly ever since. Her father was a murderer and a thief." Another rider spat. "The apple does not fall far from the tree." "Her father was those things," Blake agreed, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. "But she is not her father. She is her own person, and she has done nothing wrong." "The people of Owyhee disagree," the badge-wearer said. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and held it up. "This is a warrant signed by Judge Harrison. Sara Emerson is charged with aiding and abetting a known criminal. She is to be returned to Owyhee for trial." "That is a lie," Sara cried out, finding her voice. "I never helped him. I did not even know what he was doing until the sheriff arrested him." "You let him stay in your house," the man countered. "You fed him and sheltered him." "That is aiding." "He was my father," Sara said desperately. "I did not know he was planning crimes. I thought he was trying to make a new start." "Tell it to the judge," the badge-wearer said dismissively. He gestured to his men. "Take her." 2 of the riders started forward, but Blake and several of the Double R hands moved to block them. The tension ratcheted even higher, everyone's hands near their weapons now. "You are not taking her anywhere," Blake said flatly. "You want to interfere with the law, Cowboy?" the badge-wearer asked dangerously. "That depends," Jack interjected, his voice hard. "You said you have a warrant signed by Judge Harrison. Judge Cyrus Harrison?" "That is right." "Well, that is real interesting, seeing as how Judge Harrison lost his position 2 months ago for corruption. He was taking bribes and signing false warrants for people who wanted to settle personal scores. I read about it in the territorial newspaper, so whatever paper you are holding is worth less than the ink it is printed with." The badge-wearer's face darkened with anger. "This warrant is legal." "No, it is not," Jack said calmly. "And I think you know that. I think you and these men are from Owyhee, and you decided to come after this girl because you are a bunch of small-minded cowards who need someone to blame for what her father did. Well, she is under my protection now, and you are trespassing on my land, so I suggest you mount up and ride out before I have my men escort you." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Sara held her breath, terrified that violence would erupt. The badge-wearer looked at Jack, then at Blake and the other ranch hands, clearly calculating his odds. Finally, his eyes shifted to Sara, and he smiled coldly. "This is not over, girl. You cannot hide forever." "She is not hiding," Blake said evenly. "She is living her life, and if you or anyone else from Owyhee comes after her again, you will have to go through all of us. Is that clear?" The badge-wearer spat into the dirt, then jerked his head toward his men. Let us go. This place stinks anyway. The riders mounted and wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they galloped away. Sara watched them disappear, her whole body shaking with reaction. The moment they were out of sight, her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground. Blake was beside her instantly, his arms around her shoulders. It is all right. They are gone. You are safe. They will come back, Sara whispered, or they will send others. I am never going to be free of this, Blake, never. Listen to me, Blake said firmly, taking her face in his hands so she had to meet his eyes. Those men were cowards and liars. That warrant was fake. You have committed no crime, Sara. They have no legal grounds to arrest you. But they will try anyway, Sara said, tears streaming down her face. And eventually, they will succeed. Or worse, someone here will get hurt defending me. I cannot let that happen. I need to leave. I need to go somewhere far away where no one has ever heard of my father or Oahe. You are not leaving, Blake said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. Do you hear me? You are not running anymore. Blake, I have to... No, he interrupted, his blue eyes fierce. I let you walk away over my dead body. Sara Emerson, you belong here. With me. With us. And I will be damned if I let those bastards drive you away. Sara stared at him, her heart pounding. Blake, what are you saying? He took a shaky breath, and she realized his hands were trembling slightly against her face. I am saying that I love you, Sara. I have loved you for months now, maybe since the first day I found you in the desert. I am saying that I want you to stay here, not just as a worker at the ranch, but as my wife, if you will have me. The world seemed to stop spinning. Sara could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at Blake's earnest face. You love me, she whispered. With everything I have, Blake said. And if you do not feel the same way, if you see me as just the man who helped you, I will accept that and never speak of it again. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that you have a place here with me, if you want it. If I want it? Sara's voice broke on a sob that was half laugh, half cry. Blake Porter, I have loved you since the moment you gave me water and told me I was not my father's crimes. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see good in people. I love how you make me feel safe and valued and worthy. I love you so much it terrifies me because I am so afraid of losing you. Blake's face broke into a smile so bright and joyful that it took her breath away. Then marry me, Sara. Be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worthy of every good thing. Yes, Sara breathed. Yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more. Blake pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. Around them, the ranch hands who had witnessed the whole thing began to cheer and whistle. Maria appeared from the cookhouse, crying happy tears and shouting blessings in Spanish. Jack stood nearby, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. When Blake finally pulled back enough to look at Sara again, his eyes were suspiciously bright. I am going to make you happy, he promised. I swear it, Sara. Every single day. You already do, she said, and kissed him. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Maria insisted on cooking an elaborate feast, and Jack invited neighbors from nearby properties. Blake's friend, a ranch hand named Sam who could read scripture, performed the ceremony under the cottonwood trees by the creek where Blake and Sara had spent so many evenings talking. Sara wore a dress Maria helped her sew, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Blake wore his best shirt and pants, his hair freshly trimmed and his face cleanly shaven. When he saw Sara walking toward him on Jack's arm, since the foreman had kindly offered to stand in as her father, his face reflected such open adoration that several people in the small crowd wiped away tears. The vows were traditional, but when Blake spoke his promises, he added something extra. I vow to always see you for who you truly are, not who others tried to make you. I vow to defend you, cherish you, and remind you every day that you are good and worthy and loved. Sarah's own vows came through tears. I vow to honor the man you are, the man who saw value in a woman dying in the desert. I vow to stand beside you through whatever comes and to love you with my whole heart for all my days. When Sam pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed Sarah with such tenderness and joy that the gathered crowd burst into applause and cheers. Maria threw rice, and Jack broke out a bottle of good whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Sarah found herself passed from partner to partner as different ranch hands asked for dances, all of them offering congratulations and good wishes. But her eyes constantly found Blake, and his found hers, as though they were tethered by invisible strings. Finally, as the moon rose high and the party began to wind down, Blake took Sarah's hand and led her away from the gathering. Jack had given them a small cabin on the property, one of the line shacks that had been fixed up and made comfortable. It was not large, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and sturdy, and theirs. Inside, Blake lit a lamp and turned to face his new wife. The playfulness from earlier had given way to something deeper, more intense. He took both her hands in his thumbs stroking across her knuckles. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "I did not know it was possible to be this happy," Sarah answered honestly. "6 months ago, I was dying in the desert, certain my life was over. Now I am married to the best man I have ever known, surrounded by people who care about me, with a future stretching ahead full of possibility. It feels like a miracle." "You are the miracle," Blake said. He reached up and gently unpinned her hair, letting it fall in dark waves around her shoulders. "You survived when anyone else would have died. You kept going when you had every reason to give up. You chose to hope when hope seemed impossible. That is all you, Sarah. Your strength, your courage, your beautiful spirit." Sarah rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into the gesture. Blake responded with equal passion, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Mrs. Porter," he whispered. "I love you, Mr. Porter," she whispered back. He swept her into his arms, making her laugh, and carried her to the bedroom. The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. The weeks and months that followed were the happiest of Sarah's life. She and Blake settled into married life with surprising ease, as though they had been together for years rather than months. They worked hard during the days, Blake with the cattle and horses, Sarah in the cookhouse and around their little cabin. But the evenings and Sundays were theirs, spent in quiet conversation, long walks, and the simple pleasure of being together. Winter came to Nevada, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. The ranch work changed with the seasons, focusing more on maintenance and caring for the animals through harsh weather. Sarah learned to cook heartier meals, thick stews, and fresh bread that warmed the hands and filled the belly. She knitted Blake a scarf and new gloves, which he wore with obvious pride. For Christmas, Blake gave Sarah a small wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with intricate flowers. Inside was a gold ring set with a tiny diamond. "I know I already gave you a wedding ring," Blake said as Sarah stared at the gift with wide eyes. "But that was my grandmother's ring that my mother sent. This one I bought with money I saved. I wanted you to have something that came directly from me." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed with love. "It is perfect. You are perfect." "Far from it," Blake said with a laugh. "But I am yours." "And I am yours," Sarah replied. The threat from Oahe seemed to have faded after that confrontation in October. No more men with false warrants appeared, and Sarah began to relax, to believe that maybe, finally, she was truly free of her past. Then in late January, a letter arrived. Jack brought it to Sarah one afternoon, his expression troubled. This came in the mail, he said. It is addressed to you. Sara took the envelope with trembling hands. The return address was from an attorney's office in Carson City. She opened it carefully, Blake reading over her shoulder. The letter was brief and formal. It informed Sara that her father's estate, such as it was, had been settled. All debts had been paid from the sale of his personal effects. What remained, a sum of $80, was legally hers as his sole heir. The money was being held in trust and could be collected at the attorney's office at her convenience. I do not want it, Sara said immediately, thrusting the letter away. I do not want anything from him. It is a fair amount of money, Sara, Blake said carefully. You could use it to— I do not care, Sara interrupted, her voice sharp. That money probably came from his crimes, from the people he hurt. I will not touch it. Blake put his hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm. All right. Then what do you want to do with it? Sara took a deep breath, thinking. Is there a way to give it back to Oahe? To the families of the men he killed, or to help rebuild what he destroyed? Blake and Jack exchanged glances. I am sure the attorney could arrange something like that, Jack said, if you write him back with instructions. Then that is what I want, Sara said firmly. Let some good come from that man's life, even if it is only in the very end. Blake smiled at her, pride evident in his eyes. You are remarkable, you know that? I'm trying to do what is right, Sara said. That is all. She wrote to the attorney that very afternoon, explaining her wishes. The money was to be divided among the 3 widows of the men her father had killed, with any excess going to rebuild the general store he had burned. She signed the letter, sealed it, and felt as though she had finally closed a door on that chapter of her life. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new calves. The ranch came alive with activity, and everyone worked from dawn until after dusk. Sara discovered she was pregnant in April, the realization coming when she could no longer stand the smell of coffee without feeling ill. Maria guessed immediately and pulled her into a tight hug, talking rapidly in excited Spanish. When Sara told Blake that evening, he went very still, his eyes searching her face. Truly, he asked, his voice rough. Truly, Sara confirmed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby, Blake. He let out a whoop of joy and swept her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down carefully, as though she were made of glass, his expression shifting to concern. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you still be working so hard? I am fine, Sara assured him, cupping his face. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong, and I have Maria to help me, and most importantly, I have you. You have me, Blake agreed, pulling her into his arms. Always and forever, you have me. Their son was born in December, a week before Christmas. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Blake, pacing outside the cabin while Maria and a midwife attended Sara, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But finally, after nearly 20 hours, he heard the sound he had been praying for, a baby's loud, angry cry. Maria opened the door, tears streaming down her smiling face. You have a son, she announced, a big, healthy boy. And Sara, she is tired but well. Blake pushed past her into the bedroom. Sara lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shone as she looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms. When she saw Blake, her smile widened. Come meet your son, she said softly. Blake approached slowly, almost reverently. He looked down at the baby, taking in the small red face, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fists waving in the air. He is perfect, Blake breathed. He has your eyes, Sara said. Look, they are blue. All babies have blue eyes at first, Blake said, but he could not stop staring. What should we name him? They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Now, Sarah looked up at her husband and said, Benjamin, Benjamin James Porter, after your father and grandfather. Blake's eyes filled with tears. His father had died when Blake was just 14, and he had missed the man every day since. Benjamin, he repeated. Ben, that is perfect, Sarah, thank you. He is yours, Sarah said simply. Of course he should carry your family names. Blake sat on the edge of the bed and carefully, nervously took his son into his arms. The baby squirmed and fussed for a moment, then settled, his tiny hand grasping Blake's finger. Blake felt his heart crack open, flooded with more love than he thought possible. Hello, Ben, he whispered. I am your father, and I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You are going to grow up knowing you are loved and wanted. You are going to have opportunities I never had. And you are going to know your mother, who is the strongest, bravest, most wonderful woman in the world. Sarah watched her husband with their newborn son, and despite her exhaustion, she felt completely at peace. This was her family. This was her home. This was the life she had built from the ashes of her father's crimes and the cruelty of people who could not see past bloodlines. As winter gave way to another spring, the Porter family thrived. Ben grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. Blake proved to be a devoted father, waking in the night to walk with Ben when he was fussy, playing with him for hours, talking to him constantly, even though the baby could not understand words yet. Sarah balanced motherhood with her work, though Jack insisted she take on lighter duties, and Maria treated her like a daughter who needed constant fussing over. The ranch continued to prosper, and Jack announced he was giving Blake a promotion to assistant foreman, along with a significant raise in pay. You have earned it, Jack told Blake when he tried to protest. You are the best hand I have ever had, and I trust you completely. Besides, you have a family to support now. With the extra money, Blake began planning to build them a larger house. Nothing grand, but something with more space for their growing family. He worked on it in his spare time, often with help from other ranch hands who had become friends. The house slowly took shape on a pretty spot near the creek, with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a porch facing the sunset. On Sarah's 24th birthday, Blake carried her across the threshold of their new home, Ben laughing in her arms. Maria and Jack had helped furnish it with a table, chairs, a beautiful quilt for their bed, and countless other small touches that made it feel like home. Do you like it? Blake asked anxiously as Sarah explored each room. Like it? Sarah turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Blake, it is more than I ever dreamed of. It is perfect. Everything is perfect. He crossed to her and wrapped his arms around both her and Ben, creating a small circle of family. You deserve perfect, he said against her hair. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. I already have everything I need, Sarah said. I have you and Ben and a real home. I have work that gives me purpose and friends who care about me. I have a life I built with my own hands, a life no one can take away. That is worth more than all the gold in Nevada. As the years passed, the Porter family continued to grow and flourish. When Ben was 3, Sarah gave birth to twin girls, Catherine and Lucy, who had their mother's dark hair and their father's blue eyes. 2 years after that came another boy, Matthew, who was quiet and thoughtful, even as an infant. Blake eventually became foreman of the Double R when Jack retired, a position he held with fairness and skill. Sarah turned their home into a haven, raising their children with love and teaching them the values of hard work, kindness, and judging people by their actions rather than their bloodlines. The children grew up knowing the story of how their parents met, though in simplified, age-appropriate versions. They knew their mother had been treated badly, through no fault of her own, and that their father had been brave enough to stand up for what was right. They learned that family was not just about blood, but about the people who chose to love and support you. Occasionally, someone new to the area would hear the name Emerson and make a connection to the criminal from Oahe. but Sara had built such a solid reputation as Blake Porter's wife, as a respected member of the community, that such whispers died quickly. And if anyone was foolish enough to bring up her father directly, they would find themselves facing not just Blake's anger, but the defensive fury of the entire Double R crew. Maria lived to be 87 years old, long enough to teach Sara's daughters all her best recipes and to spoil Sara's grandchildren with candy and stories. Jack lived out his retirement in a cabin on the ranch, still consulted on important decisions and still loved by everyone who knew him. Both of them were buried on the ranch property they had called home for so many decades, their graves marked with simple stones and fresh flowers. On Sara's 40th birthday, she and Blake rode out to the place where he had found her 20 years earlier. She had not been back since that terrible day, but Blake had asked her to come, saying he had something to show her. They rode in comfortable silence, their horses side by side. When they reached the spot, Blake dismounted and helped Sara down. He walked a few steps into the desert and stopped, pointing to the ground. "Do you see it?" he asked. Sara looked and gasped. Where the sand had once been barren and dead, wildflowers now grew. Not many, but enough to make a splash of color against the pale earth. Desert marigolds and lupines and Indian paintbrush, all blooming cheerfully in the Nevada sun. "How?" Sara breathed. "Seeds blow on the wind," Blake said. "Water runs underground. Life finds a way, even in the hardest places." He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "You were dying here, Sara. You had every reason to give up, but you did not. You kept fighting, kept hoping, and you survived. And now look at you. Look at what you built from that survival. 4 amazing children, a home, a community, a life full of love." "We built it," Sara corrected, squeezing his hands. "I could not have done any of it without you." "We built it together," Blake agreed. "And I would not change a single moment, not even the hard ones, because they all led us here, to this place, to this life." Sara leaned against her husband, looking at the unexpected flowers blooming in the desert. She thought about the frightened, broken girl she had been, cast out and left to die. She thought about everything she had endured and overcome, and she thought about the incredible gift Blake had given her when he looked at her and saw not a criminal's daughter, but a person worthy of love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that day?" she asked quietly. "No," Blake said simply, "because I did find you, and everything that followed was meant to be." They stood together in the desert where death had nearly claimed her, surrounded by impossible flowers, proof that even in the harshest environments, beauty could take root and thrive. Sara thought it was the perfect metaphor for her life. As they rode back to the ranch, back to their children and their home and the life they had built together, Sara sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. She had been cast out for being the daughter of a criminal, condemned for crimes she did not commit. But a cowboy had looked at her and said the words that changed everything. "You are not your father's crime." And in believing those words, in choosing to see herself as Blake saw her, Sara had discovered the truth. She was not defined by her father's sins or by the cruelty of people who could not see past bloodlines. She was defined by her own choices, her own actions, her own heart. She was Sara Porter, beloved wife and mother, respected member of the community, survivor of the desert, and builder of a beautiful life. She was exactly who she had always been meant to be, free at last from the shadow of her father's crimes, standing in the full light of her own worth. That evening, the Porter family gathered for dinner around the large table Blake had built. Ben, now a strapping young man of 17, teased his younger siblings while helping set plates. The twins, 14 years old and inseparable, argued cheerfully about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Matthew, 12 and already showing signs of inheriting his father's calm wisdom, read quietly in the corner until Sara called everyone to eat. Blake said grace, his voice warm with gratitude for the food, the health of his family, and the blessing of another day together. Sara looked around the table at her children's faces, so beloved and so familiar, and felt her heart swell almost painfully with love. After dinner, Blake and Sara sat on their porch, as they did most evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Blake reached over and took Sara's hand, threading their fingers together. "Happy?" he asked, the same question he had posed on their wedding night all those years ago. "So happy I could burst," Sara answered, the same joy in her voice now as then. "Thank you, Blake, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for loving me when I was unlovable, for giving me this life." "You were never invisible," Blake said, "and you were never unlovable. I just saw what was already there." Sara leaned her head on his shoulder, content beyond measure. In the distance, she could see the outline of the Double R barn, the corrals, the other buildings that made up the ranch that had been her salvation. She could hear Maria's voice calling from the cookhouse, still working even though she was well into her 70s. She could smell the sage and dust and livestock that meant home. "Tell me something," Blake said after a while. "If you could go back and change things, if you could make it so your father never came to Oahe, so you never had to suffer what you did, would you?" Sara was quiet for a long moment, considering. "5 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation," she admitted. "I would have done anything to erase that pain. But now, no, I would not change it, because all of that suffering, all of that hardship, it brought me here, to you, to our children, to this life, and I would endure 1,000 deserts to have what we have now." Blake kissed her temple, a gesture so familiar and comfortable it made Sara's eyes prick with tears. "That is how I know you are the strongest person I have ever met," he said. "Not because you survived, but because you can look back at your pain and find meaning in it." As full darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, Sara and Blake called their children inside. They helped the younger ones prepare for bed, listened to Ben talk about his plans to ask the neighbor's daughter to the barn dance, and kissed each small forehead with the tenderness of parents who knew how precious and fleeting childhood was. Finally, Sara and Blake retired to their own room, the space they had shared for nearly 18 years. They prepared for sleep with the comfortable routine of long marriage, and when they finally lay down together, Blake wrapped his arms around Sara and held her close. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "Every day I love you more than the day before." "And I love you," Sara whispered back. "My rescuer, my husband, my home." They drifted off to sleep together, comfortable and content. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of cruelty and judgment. Outside, the Nevada night sang with crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in a small house on a prosperous ranch, the Porter family slept peacefully, safe and loved and free. Sara's story had begun with rejection and death, with being judged and condemned for crimes that were not hers. But it had transformed into something far greater, a tale of survival and redemption, of love that saw past bloodlines to the truth of a person's heart, of building a life on foundations of courage and hope rather than fear and prejudice. She was not her father's crime. She never had been. She was simply Sara, a woman who had faced the worst the world could offer and emerged stronger, kinder, and more determined to live a life defined by love rather than hate. And that, she thought, as sleep claimed her in Blake's arms, was the greatest victory of all. The years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Ben grew into a fine young man who eventually married the neighbor's daughter, a sweet girl named Annie, who fit seamlessly into the Porter family. They built a house on Double R land with Jack's blessing and Blake's help, and soon gave Sara and Blake their first grandchild, a boy they named Blake Jr. The twins, Catherine and Lucy, proved to be as different as two people could be despite sharing a face. Catherine loved working with the horses and often rode out with her father to check fence lines. Lucy preferred staying inside with her mother, learning to cook and sew and manage a household. Both were courted by respectable young men from neighboring ranches when they came of age. Matthew, the quiet one, surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that he wanted to study law. Blake and Sara scraped together the money to send him to school in San Francisco, proud beyond measure that their son had such ambitions. He wrote home faithfully every week, and when he returned for summers, he helped his father with ranch business and contracts, putting his growing legal knowledge to practical use. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Blake took Sara back to Oahe. She had not been there since the day she was cast out, and she was nervous about returning. But Blake had made inquiries and learned some interesting things. The town had changed significantly in the quarter century since Sara's exile. Many of the people who had condemned her were dead or moved away. Sheriff Morrison had died of a heart attack. Mrs. Henderson had lost the mercantile and moved to live with her son in California. Tom Watkins had been killed in a mining accident. The Reverend Collins had retired and been replaced by a younger minister. More importantly, the three widows whose husbands Sara's father had killed had received the money Sara sent through the attorney all those years ago. They had used it wisely, investing in businesses and property, and all three had become respected members of the community. When they heard that Sara Emerson Porter might be visiting, they sent word that they would very much like to meet her. Sara agreed, though her hands trembled as she and Blake rode into Oahe on a bright spring morning. The town looked smaller than she remembered, less imposing. The bank her father had robbed had been rebuilt. The general store stood where it always had, though with a new name painted on the sign. They went first to the church, where the widows had agreed to meet them. Sara's heart pounded as she walked up the steps, Blake's steady presence beside her. Inside, three women waited, all in their 60s now, all watching Sara with expressions she could not quite read. "Mrs. Porter," the oldest one said, stepping forward. Her name was Harriet Chambers, and her husband had been the first man Sara's father killed. "Thank you for coming." "I am not sure why you wanted to see me," Sara said honestly. "I cannot imagine you have anything kind to say." Harriet surprised her by reaching out and taking Sara's hand. "On the contrary, we asked you here to thank you." Sara blinked in confusion. "Thank me? For the money you sent," another widow, Elizabeth Moore, explained. "You did not have to do that. By law, you were entitled to your inheritance, but you gave it to us instead, the families your father destroyed. That took more character and grace than most people possess. I could not keep it," Sara said quietly. It felt wrong. "It was more than the money, though," the third widow, Mary Sullivan, added. "It was what the money represented. It showed us that you were nothing like your father, that you cared about making things right, even when none of what happened was your fault." Harriet squeezed Sara's hand gently. "We owe you an apology, all of us, the whole town. We judged you for your father's crimes, and that was wrong. We cast you out when we should have offered support. We let fear and anger turn us into people we should not have been." Sara felt tears building behind her eyes. "I never blamed any of you. You lost people you loved because of my father. Your anger was justified." "Anger at him, yes," Elizabeth said, "but not at you. Never at you. And we are sorry, more than words can express, for the pain we caused you." The apology Sara had never expected to receive, had never even let herself hope for, broke something open inside her. She found herself crying, and suddenly all three widows were embracing her, offering comfort and seeking forgiveness at the same time. Blake watched with suspicion, his throat tight. These women, who had every reason to hate Sara, had chosen instead to see the truth of who she was. It had taken them 25 years, but they had gotten there. After the tears subsided and everyone had composed themselves, they sat together in the church pews and talked. The widows told Sara how they had used her money, how it had allowed them to build new lives from their grief. They spoke about how, Over the years, they had come to realize how wrong the town had been to treat Sara as they had. "We tried to find you," Harriet said. "About 10 years ago, we wanted to apologize, to make amends, but no one knew where you had gone. Some said you had died in the desert. Others claimed you had gone east. We never stopped feeling guilty about what we did." "I survived," Sara said simply, reaching for Blake's hand. "This man found me when I was dying and gave me a chance at a new life. I have been at the Double R Ranch ever since. I have 4 children now, and 2 grandchildren. I have a good life." "You deserved a good life then too," Mary said sadly, "and we denied you that. We can never make up for what we took from you." Sara looked at these 3 women, seeing their genuine remorse and sorrow. She thought about the anger she had carried for so many years, the hurt of being rejected and cast out, and she realized that holding on to those feelings would only poison the beautiful life she had built. "I forgive you," Sara said clearly. "All of you. The whole town. I will not carry that burden anymore. It is done." The relief on the widows' faces was profound. They thanked her over and over, their gratitude overwhelming. Before Sara and Blake left, Harriet pressed a small package into Sara's hands. "This was your mother's," she said. "After you were cast out, I went to your house and took some things for safekeeping, hoping one day I could return them to you. This was the most precious." Sara unwrapped the package with trembling hands. Inside was a small leather-bound book, her mother's journal, and a locket containing tiny portraits of her parents on their wedding day. She had thought these things lost forever. "Thank you," Sara whispered, clutching the treasures to her chest. "Thank you so much." As they rode away from Owyhee for the second and final time, Sara felt lighter than she had in years. The ghosts of her past had finally been laid to rest. She was free, truly and completely free, from the shadow her father's crimes had cast over her life. "How do you feel?" Blake asked as they made their way back toward home. "Like a door has closed," Sara said. "Like I can finally put all of that behind me and just live in the present. I have nothing left to run from, nothing left to prove. I am just me, Sara Porter, and that is enough." "It always was enough," Blake said, "but I am glad you finally see it too." They rode home to the Double R, to their children and grandchildren, to the life they had built together through love and determination and refusing to let the world's cruelty define them. And Sara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In the following years, Sara took her mother's journal and began writing her own story, determined that her children and grandchildren would know the truth of where they came from and what it had taken to build the life they enjoyed. She wrote about the hardship and the heartbreak, but also about the kindness of strangers, the power of love, and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their lineage. When Matthew completed his law studies and opened a practice in Carson City, his first case was defending a young woman who was being denied an inheritance because her father had been a criminal. Matthew argued passionately that the sins of the father should not fall on the children, and he won. He built his entire legal career around defending those who were marginalized and judged unfairly, inspired by his mother's story. Catherine married a rancher from Oregon and moved north, but she visited often with her growing family. Lucy married a doctor in a nearby town and became a pillar of the community, known for her charitable work with families in need. Ben took over more and more of the ranch management as Blake grew older, proving himself every bit as capable and fair-minded as his father. Blake and Sara grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but their love never diminishing. They celebrated 50 years of marriage, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, a house full of people whose very existence was testament to the power of seeing past judgment to truth. On a warm summer evening when Sara was 70 years old and Blake 75, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Blake's health had been failing, and they both knew their time together was drawing to a close. But there was no fear in that knowledge. only gratitude for the life they had shared. Do you remember what I said to you the day I found you in the desert? Blake asked, his voice weaker than it once was, but still warm with love. You said a lot of things, Sara replied, holding his hand gently. Which part? I said you were not your father's crimes, that you were your own person. I remember, Sara said softly. Those words saved my life, Blake. Not just my physical life, but my soul. You gave me permission to see myself differently, to believe I was worth saving. You were always worth saving, Blake said. I just helped you see it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains they had watched together for 5 decades. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, home to yet another generation of porters and the countless people whose lives they had touched over the years. I love you, Blake said, as he had said 10,000 times before. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for every single day. I love you, Sara replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Thank you for seeing me when no one else could. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for being my home. Blake died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, Sara holding his hand until the very end. The entire community turned out for his funeral, a testament to the man he had been and the lives he had touched. Sara stood straight and dry-eyed through the service, her children around her, determined to honor Blake's memory with strength rather than despair. She lived another 7 years after Blake's death, long enough to see all her grandchildren grown and several great-grandchildren born. She spent her final years writing, gardening, and telling stories to anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had saved her life and taught her that a person's worth was determined by their own choices, not their family's mistakes. When Sara Porter died at 77 years old, peacefully in her sleep with her children keeping vigil, she was buried beside Blake under the cottonwood trees by the creek where they had been married so many decades before. Her tombstone read simply, Sara Emerson Porter, beloved wife, mother and friend. She was not her father's crime. The story of Sara and Blake became legend in that part of Nevada, passed down through generations as a tale of love conquering judgment, of courage triumphing over cruelty, of two people who refused to let the world define them. The Double R Ranch prospered under Ben's management and eventually passed to his children, continuing the legacy of fairness and hard work that Blake had established. And in the desert where Sara had nearly died, where Blake had found her and given her that first drink of water that saved her life, wildflowers continued to bloom every spring. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop and marvel at those impossible flowers growing in such harsh terrain, never knowing that they marked the place where a life was saved and a great love story began. Because that is what Sara's life had been, in the end. A love story. Not just the romantic love between her and Blake, though that was certainly central, but also the love of found family, of community built on mutual respect, of children raised to see the best in people, of a life constructed from nothing but determination and hope. She had been cast out for being the daughter of a criminal, condemned to die alone and unmourned, but a cowboy had looked at her and said the words that changed everything. You are not your father's crime. And in believing those words, in living those words, every single day of her life, Sara had proved them true. She was not her father's crime. She never had been. She was simply Sara, a woman who survived, who loved, who built something beautiful from ashes and desert sand. And that was more than enough. That was everything